Today we will be looking at Rayman 2 and Rayman 3 and see what lessons we can get from these games about platforming game design. I am your host, Giandomenico Lombardi, and let's dive in. So these are the things we're going to be looking at today. First, we're going to briefly summarize the history of this franchise, at least in its early titles, the ones we'll be talking about. Then we're going to be comparing the platforming between the two titles. We're going to be looking at the camera design, and finally we'll be looking at the combat design. So, let's start with the history. So, the original Rayman game was developed and released in 1995, the same as your host, by this guy, Michel Hansel, not to be confused with Insel. The original Rayman was a side-scroller platforming game like the first Mario games, and he had this very strong fairyland theme to it. The original title was released for PlayStation 1, Atari Jaguar, Sega Saturn, and also Microsoft DOS. The game was later re-released several times. Starting from Windows, it was re-released as Rayman Gold, which included more levels, and then later on they also released Rayman Designer, which included the level editor, so the player could be the designer for the game. The game was also ported to Game Boy Color and later on Game Boy Advance, and over the years got a lot of re-releases for a lot of different systems. Including Rayman Jr., which was a spin-off game which reused the same base code, the same base mechanics, but now we had a gameplay focus on either solving mathematical operations or something to do with language and grammar. So basically they try to tie in education with gaming. To, I would say, not so great success. Later on came Rayman 2. Now, originally Rayman 2 was gonna be a 2D platformer game like its predecessor, but Michel Hansel, the creator of the game, saw Crash Bandicoot at a gaming event, and he realized that 3D games were the future. 3D was the future of platforming games. And therefore the sequel was instead a 3D platformer, where most of the fairyland theming was reduced in quantity, and now instead of facing some dark wizard, you actually face robo pirates as the enemy in the games. So we can already see that the game is a bit distanced itself from the predecessor when it comes to theming and setting. Excuse me. Now, this game was originally being developed for the Sega Dreamcast this time instead of the Saturn, as that was the platform that Michel Hansel really wanted to develop for. But Ubisoft Montpellier, was of course the publisher and developer of the game, said no, the game was gonna be developed instead for Nintendo 64. So the game was completely scrapped and started from scratch and developed for the 64. But once that was released, Michel Hansel was like, okay, I released for the Nintendo 64, now let me release for whatever I want. Ubisoft agreed, and so he went back to further polish this game for a Sega Dreamcast release, and also Microsoft Windows, which is why when you compare these two games side by side, the Dreamcast edition looks more polished, and according to the creator, that would be the ultimate vision he had for the game. Despite that, Ubisoft loves money more, so the game was also ported on the PS1, where due to hardware limitation, a lot of the levels were cut, but they compensated for the cutted levels and cutted content overall by adding full voice acting for the game, which, depending on who you ask, might be for the best or for the worst. A lot of people would rather have the full game on PS1. And last but not least, Sony also requested Rayman 2 to be remade for PlayStation 2 as well as launch title, where it launched under the name Rayman Revolution, which is yet another version of the game which includes more boss fights, more mini games, and depending on who you might ask, the Dreamcast or the Revolution version might be the best, as either of them offers some exclusive things that the other version does not. If you ask the original creator, Dreamcast is the best. If you ask other people, it might be Revolution because it has more content. But after Rayman 2, they had to start working on Rayman 3. In the meantime, though, Ubisoft once again wanted to capitalize on the franchise. This was basically their Assassin's Creed before they had an Assassin's Creed. So they made Rayman M. What they realized was they had the assets to make platforming, and they have the assets to make some basic combat from Rayman 2. So what they did, they made multiplayer titles where you have arena, third-person shooting, reusing Rayman's 2 combat mechanics, and you also have humanoid racing using the movement and platforming mechanic. This game was originally released for PlayStation 2, and then 1 year later re-released for Xbox and GameCube, which were actually very different versions from the original PlayStation 2 release. The feel of the characters and movement and mechanics was deeply improved, and also the UI was redesigned from the more ugly looking one from PS2 to the better one featured in the Xbox and GameCube releases. And last but not least, in an amazing move, Ubisoft ported this game from the PS2 to the PS1. And trust me, if PS1 was still selling strongly nowadays, I'm pretty sure Ubisoft will also port the latest Assassin's Creed there, because that's Ubisoft for you. Anyhow, during this period and during the development of Rayman 3, which happened at the same time as this Rayman M spin-off, Michel Ancel decided that he was done with the franchise, so he left. And instead he asked the rest of his team to finish Rayman 3 with their own vision for the game, and no longer being under the overseen by the original creator. So this game eventually released on PS2, Xbox and GameCube, and later was also ported to Xbox 360 and PS3. However, it did not really have the amount of re-releases than Rayman 1 and Rayman 2 had, and that was mostly because it was not as warmly received as the predecessors were. Still, it's very fun to look at these three games and realize that they are all very different from each other. And a very fun fact, there's also Rayman 3 for the Game Boy Advance, which is called Rayman 3, like Rayman 3. It has the same gameplay as Rayman 1, and the characters and story they are lifted from Rayman 2, so this Rayman 3 is basically all the three games at once in a way, which is a very fun fact. Alright, now let's dive into the actual important things. Hopefully some other people join in the meantime. First we're gonna be looking at the platforming. So, Rayman 2 versus Rayman 3. Let's compare the way that they do platforming. When we look at Rayman 2, the player is given a number of game mechanics that they can use whenever they want in the way that they are taught to use them. So they're introduced in a safe environment and then they're implemented in the level. And the level is like an obstacle course for the player. So the player starts at the start point, then he encounters one of the many mechanics they can use, an obstacle which can be overcome with one of the many mechanics. Like 3 jumping obstacles. They use the mechanic successfully and they go through them. Then they encounter a different mechanic, like a climbing segment. So they start this segment and they go through it again by using their mastery over the mechanic to overcome the challenge. We see jumping again, we see a nice traversal to slow down the pacing, a bit of rest moment. Then there's more jumping and then there's a swinging moment. Then the player needs to use the swinging mechanic to overcome this section. Another slow pacing moment where they can rest for a bit and see the scenery, and then another challenge, this time combining all of the 3 mechanics in once, so they need to combine climbing, swinging and jumping successfully in order to overcome this last room and reach the exit and beat the level. That's the basic way platforming works in Rayman 2. It's an obstacle course which the player can go through using the mechanics that they learned. Rayman 3 has a totally different approach. So in Rayman 3 you have locks and you have keys. And these keys, they are under the form of power-ups, which you can acquire, but they're gonna expire over time. So once they expire, you need to go back to where the key or power-up is and get it back. So, you go enter into the level and you see the exit. You want to walk into the exit, but then you realize the exit is under a gate, under a lock of some kind, which can literally be a gate, or it can be something like something you need to interact with, which yeah, basically a different form of gate. Not literally a gate, but a section which you can only go through by having the key. You explore around, you see another path. And this one as well is gated. Then you finally run into enemies and you can do combat. You do combat, the enemy is vanquished, and he releases a key, a red key. Literally, the keys in the game, as I said, are power-ups, and those power-ups are color-coded. So the keys in the games are literally blue, red, yellow, and whatever. So you grab the key, and then now you can go through this gate. So you can access this other room. You go in there, and you see it again. A lock, combat, you get the key, you open the lock, more combat, you do combat, you get the key, and then you can finally get to the exit. So, while Rayman 2 was more of an obstacle course, Rayman 3 is more of a time-based puzzle platformer with a strong emphasis on combat. Yeah. And this is the core under which both games are designed, and that's why they differ. And you can also see this difference with some of the mechanics. In Rayman 2, the way jumping works is the way gliding works. So basically this thing where you're flying after jumping, it's you jump, then you tap the jump button again, and then you're in gliding mode where you can just land slowly where you want to go. In Rayman 3 instead it's different. You need to hold the button. And what this means is when you're gliding in Rayman 2, you only need to press it once, so then you can dedicate your full attention to where to move to, and then you press it again to fall, which means that it's very responsive and you don't need to put too much effort into controlling your character. While in Rayman 3 you constantly have to hold down the button, which for the player is more mental power being dedicated to that task. So that means that the focus is no longer on, okay, I need to study the environment and know exactly when I need to land, but it's more on, I'm focusing on making my character fly because I don't need to worry about anything else. There's no like that tight platforming challenge which you have in Rayman 2. Rayman 3 is more casual oriented, so the player is able to just hold the button because they don't have to worry about studying the environment as much. And then there is the swinging, which in Rayman 2 works like this. You have these purple rings, you need to jump, you need to align yourself with the ring, and then you need to press the attack button to shoot a beam which is gonna connect you to the thing, so then you can swing. And if you need to swing between multiple of them, then you need to attach yourself to the first one, wait for the right moment, then jump off, align yourself, and shoot the next ring again. And you need to do this successfully in order to fly from one ring to the other. So it's a very tight challenge. And you always need to be very careful where you're aiming, very careful when you're gonna detach yourself, jump off the current one you're swinging from, otherwise you're gonna mess up and you're gonna fall. In Rayman 3 there's no challenge. The moment you're close to one of these hooks, rings, then you're gonna automatically lock onto it, and you're gonna be given visual feedback if you can reach it or not. In Rayman 2 you have no clue whatsoever, you just needed to aim yourself and hope that you are aimed correctly. In Rayman 3 you can see exactly if you're gonna touch yourself or not. Plus right now there's the target there even though I'm already swinging. So what I can actually do in Rayman 3 is I'm swinging, I wait until I see the target, and then I press the attack button again. I don't even need to jump off, I just need to keep pressing the button at the right time, and I can never fall. The only challenge there is that you only have the power to attach yourself to these hooks for a limited amount of time. Again, as you can see here, Rayman is blue, and that's because it currently has the blue upgrade. It currently has the blue key, and the hooks themselves, the rings themselves, they are the gate, which can only be going through if you have the right key, which is the blue costume thingy. So again, there's not really a challenge here about where the player needs to time their jump and align themselves correctly. Here the only challenge is you need to do this before your power-up runs out. So the challenge is very different, and it's more about time the puzzle platformer than it is about an actual obstacle course. So, moving on into the camera. Now, when we look at the camera, this is gonna be an easier comparison because both games have awful cameras. So both games implement your traditional third-person player-controlled third-person camera. I think I said third-person camera twice, but you get the gist of it. You can move around, and then you can tilt the camera left or right to basically look whenever you want to look. But they do something very bad, which is for 80% of the game they actually have these segments where you're gonna be locked into a fixed angle camera. In this case, for example, there is this whole jumping section. You have to jump between crates, and for the whole section you have to look at it from this top-down, half top-down point of view, isometric view maybe. But that's very bad, because since you don't have any agency where the camera looks, so you cannot really look at your surroundings, and because some of these camera angles are very bad in the games, it's very hard for the player to judge distances. So most of the time when you fall off, you're not gonna fall off because of your mistakes, you're gonna fall off because the camera failed to properly give you a sense of depth and where everything was relative to each other. Now, they had a very good reason to do this. Like, when we look at the Rayman 2, it was developed in 1998, which was a period where not all game controllers had analog sticks. Like, for example, the first PlayStation 1, when it first came out, the controller had no analog sticks. Those were implemented in a later revision of the controller throughout the PS1 era. But when developers were making games during that period, they had to account for consoles like the PS1, which will not have analog sticks. So the way they did those camera controls I mentioned earlier, they just had them binded to the shoulder case. But that means you only have L2 and R2, or whatever they're called on different platforms, but you don't have a way to control the Y-axis, the pitch of the camera. You can only control the yaw, the left to right. So they had to come up with a solution, and the solution was segments where the camera would be fixed, so the player would have a clear view of what's beneath them, so they would be able to do some sections better. And that was the excuse for Rayman 2. That's why they came with this compromise, which after replaying the game recently, I don't think it holds up very well. But then there's Rayman 3, and in Rayman 3 it was on the PS2 and Xbox and GameCube. Every console had a thumbstick, had two thumbsticks, and every game used the right thumbstick for movement, for camera movement, which is exactly what they did. So why did they still have these fixed views? Well, if you remember earlier, I mentioned that when you are jumping and you want to glide, you need to hold the jump button. But if you're using your right thumb to hold the cross button or another face button to glide, then you cannot also control the right thumbstick, which is right beneath it. So you cannot control the camera and glide at once. So because for some reason they decided to change the way that gliding worked in the game, they also had to keep this very ugly solution of switching between player control camera and fixed angle camera. I must say that when I look at the entire games side by side, I think that Rayman 3 did not had such bad fixed angle cameras, but you also need to keep in consideration that Rayman 3 focused a lot on combat and had very few platforming sections, while Rayman 2 was built around platforming. So when I look at these games, I must say that I really dislike this design choice of having fixed angle camera. It did not work for it. Kind of worked for the original Resident Evils, and I guess at the time also worked for Rayman, but compared to modern standards, that's just a slippery slope to go when it comes to camera design. And last, the combat. Now, when you look at Rayman 2, the combat is definitely the weak thing about this game. It definitely is Achilles' heel. The combat in Rayman 2 is very awful. And the way it worked was, you have this mechanic where you can basically shoot energy balls from your hands, and you can also strafe around the closest opponent when you're holding a button. So the way a combat encounter works is, you're gonna see this enemy, this robo-pirate, you're gonna hold the button to strafe around him, and then you're gonna move left and right and sometimes jump to dodge his projectile attacks while pressing the attack button to shoot at him. And basically you need to keep doing this until their death. They just keep chipping away at their health. And the way they do different enemies is they take the same robo-pirate, they change his color. Some of them have larger projectiles like this one, some of the smaller ones, and they usually just have different health amounts. That's it. It's literally always the same encounter with slightly more or less enemies, and the individual enemies have more or less health. That's basically always the same. but the game manages to make that work by having a very limited amount of combat encounters, so they just feel like, okay, I did a lot of platforming, now I have a platforming challenge which involves an actual enemy which can move around and shoots at me. But again, the actual focus in the combat is in your movement. You need to move left and right, so it feels like a platformer, like you're dodging. It's about movement, so it kind of works, and because they don't put too much combat encounters in the game, it manages not to get boring too quickly. But it's definitely not a good combat system in itself. Rayman 3 instead has one of the greatest and possibly most unique combat systems I've ever seen in a platforming game. Now, how did they manage to take that turd and polish it up in this game, which is otherwise an all-around turd? Well, you see, in Rayman 2, strafing was like, you press the button and if you're close enough you're gonna automatically lock on an enemy, but you have no clue if you're locked on or not. In Rayman 3, you have a nice target nearby close enemies which tell you if you're locked into them, even if you're not currently strafing. So you already have more information about whether you're gonna successfully hit an opponent or not. Second, while in Rayman 2 you had the infinite amount of energy balls that you can shoot, in Rayman 3 you don't shoot energy balls. You have your hands in the game are detached from your body, so you just throw your fists at the enemy and they behave like boomerangs. But because you only have two hands, that means that if you shoot once, then you can immediately shoot again, but if you shoot twice, then you need to wait for a cooldown for your hands to physically go back to your body before you can use them again. So there's more thinking involved about whether you need to spam the button or you actually need to think more carefully. Plus, if you look, there's also a arrow including to the target, which can either be like straight forward like this, it can be arched to the left, or it can also arch to the right. And what it is it reads your current movement input. So if you're moving left relative to the enemy or right, instead of throwing your fist forward, it's gonna throw it at an arch, either left or right. And that works amazingly, because then enemies can suddenly start blocking in a given direction, or there might actually be some obstacles along the way around the map which you need to look out for. So let's say there's like a bunch of crates on the right of the enemy, then you know you need to aim to the left. If there are crates right in front of the enemies, then you need to aim left and right. And if the enemy is like in a corner, then you need to aim forward, otherwise your punch is not gonna hit the enemy. And you can also use this to protect yourself, because then you can also use a pillar to protect yourself from enemy fire, while punching left or right to make your first go through. So there's more thinking involved on the part of the player about exactly what they have to do to hit the enemy, rather than just keep spamming the attack button like you do in Rayman 2. And then there's player feedback. Rayman 3 feels way more juicy. When you hit the enemy, you actually have more particles flying around, better sounds, and you also get this nice text which tells you exactly that you hit them and makes you feel good about it. And if you can manage to kill an enemy without ever getting hit by that specific enemy, then you're gonna get another prompt on screen saying that you did an amazing job, and other elements like that to reinforce the idea that you must feel good about what you just did. And then there's also enemy variation. In Rayman 3 you have a lot of different enemies. You have the one which shoots projectiles, much like the pirate in Rayman 2. Then you have different variation of that. This one can shoot 3 small projectiles at once. There's another variation which shoots 3 bigger ones which go in different directions. There's this other guy which can basically create an energy shield around another enemy, so you need to kill him first before you can go for the normal enemy. They're flying enemies, so there's a lot of enemy variations, including this last one, mini boss type, where as I mentioned before, you have power-ups which are keys, and these power-ups / keys can also work in combat in unique ways. For example, this one is the red power-up, which gives you a stronger punch, and you need to have this one equipped in order to have these shielded enemies drop their armor momentarily, so that you can keep damaging them while the armor is down. So do a very good job of taking every one of those power-ups that are intended for level navigation and give them a double purpose for also combat. And finally, when we look at boss fights, both games have good boss fights, I would say, but you can definitely see different philosophies between the game design between the two titles. Because in Rayman 2, there's this boss fight, for example, where you can see that they chose to make their boss fights focus on platforming. So you have this guy over here, it's a golem, which is gonna shoot projectiles at you. What you need to do is you need to swing through these hoops in order to go through the section without getting hit by its projectiles, and eventually shoot once this stalagmite, which is gonna crash down and kill the boss for you. So the boss challenge is all about platforming. While in Rayman 3 you have more traditional boss fights, where you have your enemy, which is gonna go through different stages, and you need to dodge their attacks until they reach that phase where they're exposed, and then you can hit them in order to bring down their health bar. So you can definitely see here what the difference in the philosophy of the development team was. Rayman 2 was all about platforming, so the boss fight is a glorified platforming section. Where Rayman 3 was more combat focused and with really bad platforming, I would say, so the boss fights were actually a proper example of their combat system, but brought to the extreme and the ultimate challenge for that combat system. So, in conclusion, in my opinion, Rayman 2 is definitely an amazing platformer, one of the earlier 3D platformers which defined this genre. And the combat is not amazing, but it's used properly, so it doesn't overstay its welcome. So it's digestible if you want to play that game, even compared to modern standards. Rayman 3 instead has a very strong and unique combat system, which I really liked. But the game itself is not really that interesting. The platforming section are really scarce and not that amazing. In the last couple of levels there are some good platforming, but most of the game focuses too much on combat and falls short as a platformer overall. And now it's the best time to speak about our sponsor, Space Frame! At Space Frame, we believe that the future of the city belongs to its citizen. With our amazing application, you can vote on what you want to be built in your public park to make your city grow as an amazing green place for you and your friends. Use the code Dubai 2020 to find out why Jonas is not going to India this year. Thank you very much. You can applaud now. So, are there any questions?
One question: why do you believe Dubai is in India?